Isaiah Ziegler sat at his desk, staring at the latest employee satisfaction reports, his jaw tightening. The numbers were worse than he'd ever seen. Complaints about low morale, high turnover, and even a few mentions of managers mistreating staff. He had built this fast food chain from the ground up, starting with a single burger joint and expanding to 7 locations. But somehow, he had lost touch with the people keeping it running. He had trusted his district manager's reports, but they never mentioned anything serious. Either the issues were being downplayed, or no one felt safe speaking up. Isaiah wasn't the kind of man to sit back and hope for the best. He needed to see the truth for himself. Within days, he had a plan. He would go undercover as a new trainee at one of the locations with the worst employee feedback. His thick beard was shaved, his usually slicked back hair was buzzed short, and a pair of glasses completed the disguise. No one at the store had ever met him personally, most only knew his name from corporate emails or posters in the office. On Monday morning, Isaiah walked into the restaurant under the name Ian, wearing a wrinkled uniform handed to him by the store's manager, Rick. The moment he stepped behind the counter, he could feel the tension in the air. Workers moved mechanically, heads down, voices quiet. "Don't expect anyone to help you," a young woman muttered as she passed by. Her name tag read Harper Mendez. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well in days. Isaiah frowned. "What do you mean? You'll see," she sighed, adjusting her headset. "Just don't mess up, or Rick will have you scrubbing the floor with a toothbrush." Rick, the store manager, was a broad man in his 50s who seemed to enjoy barking orders more than actually working. He had barely explained anything to Isaiah before shoving him onto the front counter. Within minutes, Isaiah was overwhelmed. Orders were coming in fast, customers were impatient, and the screens flashed nonstop. Harper noticed his struggle and subtly guided him through it, whispering shortcuts and tips when Rick wasn't looking. By lunchtime, Isaiah had seen enough to confirm something was very wrong. Rick spent most of his time in the office, only coming out to yell at employees. The assistant manager, Lewis, looked fed up but avoided confrontation. Meanwhile, the crew worked tirelessly with no breaks, no appreciation, just stress. But it was what Isaiah saw after closing that hit the hardest. As he walked out to his car, he spotted Harper sitting on the curb, her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. He hesitated. He wasn't supposed to get too personal before the reveal, but something about this felt different. He walked over, keeping his voice gentle. "You okay?" Harper wiped her eyes quickly, forcing a laugh. "Yeah, just bills piling up, rent's overdue, and I had to pick up my little sister's medical expenses. It's just a lot." Isaiah sat beside her. "You don't have anyone to help," she shook her head. "Parents passed, it's just me and her." She gave a small, tired smile. "But it's fine. Just gotta work harder, right?" Isaiah clenched his jaw. No one should have to carry this much alone. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few folded bills, more than enough to cover rent. "Here, take this." Harper's eyes widened. I can't just take it," he insisted. "Consider it an advance. Pay it forward when you can." Tears welled up in her eyes, but before she could say anything, Rick's voice cut through the air. "Harper, you're still here. You know we don't pay for overtime." She stiffened, quickly stuffing the money into her pocket. "I was just leaving." Rick barely spared Isaiah a glance before storming back inside. Isaiah's hands curled into fists. He had seen enough. This wasn't just bad management, this was exploitation, and he wasn't going to let it continue. Isaiah arrived early the next morning, stepping into the restaurant to find the same drained expressions on everyone's faces. The air was thick with unspoken exhaustion, employees moving through their routines like they were walking through quicksand. The back kitchen was already sweltering, the scent of grease and overworked fryers clinging to the air. Rick stood near the registers, a cup of coffee in hand, watching everyone with an expression that carried more judgment than leadership. He barely acknowledged Isaiah before turning his attention to Lewis, the assistant manager, who was hastily organizing inventory sheets near the back. Without a word, Isaiah grabbed an apron and moved toward the prep station. Harper was already there, organizing frozen patties onto trays, her movements mechanical. She looked up briefly, her eyes flickering with recognition before she turned back to her work. If she was embarrassed about the night before, she didn't show it. Isaiah worked beside her, absorbing everything the way the kitchen was running on half the staff it clearly needed, the overheard grumbles from employees about missing pay, and the way Rick's voice carried through the store whenever he decided something wasn't up to his impossible standards. At one point, a young employee, no older than 19, dropped a tray of buns. The moment the plastic container hit the floor, Rick was on him. The kid barely got the words out before Rick waved him off. His voice was sharp. "You're lucky I don't dock your next paycheck for wasting product." Isaiah's jaw tightened. There was no patience, no effort to teach, just fear. By midday, Isaiah had seen enough to know that this wasn't just an isolated issue. It was a pattern, and it was destroying the people who worked here. During his break, he stepped outside, leaning against the back wall of the restaurant. He watched as Harper and Lewis spoke in hushed tones near the dumpster, their postures tense. Lewis ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "I've told corporate about this before." Harper's voice was quiet but firm. "And," Lewis exhaled sharply, "nothing changed." Isaiah stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of their words. If complaints had been made before and ignored, then the problem ran deeper than just Rick. As he stepped back inside, he found himself near the office door, slightly ajar. Inside, Rick was on the phone. His voice was low but carried an edge of irritation. "I don't care if they're short-staffed. If they quit, they quit. We'll hire someone else dumb enough to take the job." Isaiah felt something cold settle in his stomach. The rest of the day passed in a blur of orders, overheated kitchens, and employees biting their tongues. Harper barely spoke, but Isaiah noticed the way her hands trembled when she counted change, the way she nearly dropped a tray as she moved through the dining area. By the time the evening rush hit, the tension in the restaurant had reached its peak. A line of impatient customers stretched to the door, the kitchen struggling to keep up. Lewis was running between stations, trying to cover for missing staff, while Rick stood near the counter, watching but not helping. When an order came out wrong, Harper turned to Rick, her voice hesitant. "We're out of the special sauce. Should we comp the order?" Or Rick cut her off. "Figure it out, Mendez. I don't have time for hand-holding." Harper stiffened, her face pale. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it, turning back toward the kitchen. Isaiah saw the moment her composure cracked. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white, her breathing uneven. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Moving toward the front of the store, Isaiah straightened his posture, his voice even but firm. "You know, Rick, a good manager would have stepped in to help by now." Rick turned, brows furrowing. "What did you just say?" Isaiah reached for the glasses he had been wearing and slowly pulled them off. The tension in the room shifted instantly. Employees froze, eyes widening as recognition flickered across their faces. Rick's expression morphed from irritation to something resembling panic. Isaiah met his gaze, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "I said a good manager would have helped." Rick's face paled, his usual arrogance replaced by something far more uncertain. The restaurant had gone silent, the weight of Isaiah's words settling over the employees like a thick fog. Lewis took a step back, his eyes darting between Isaiah and Rick, as if waiting for an explosion. Harper stood frozen near the register, her fingers still curled around the edge of the counter. Rick opened his mouth, then closed it. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, trying to compose himself. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual bite. "This some kind of joke?" Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. "No joke, Rick." His voice remained calm, controlled. "I've spent the last few days working alongside these employees. I've seen how you treat them." He let the words sink in, scanning the faces of the staff. "And I've seen enough." Rick let out a short breath, shoulders squaring. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw," but Isaiah cut him off. "I saw employees skipping breaks because they're afraid of getting written up. I saw you berate a 19-year-old for making a mistake instead of coaching him. I heard you on the phone saying you don't care if people quit because you'll just replace them." His voice hardened. "That's not leadership." A murmur rippled through the employees. Some exchanged glances, others looked at the floor, but none spoke up. Not yet. Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. This is a business. I run it the way I see fit. Isaiah exhaled slowly, keeping his temper in check. He had expected resistance. Running a business doesn't mean running people into the ground. You've created an environment where your employees are exhausted, undervalued, and afraid to speak up. His eyes flicked to Harper, then back to Rick. That ends today. Rick scoffed, but the sound lacked confidence. And what? You're just going to fire me? Isaiah didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Lewis, who stood stiffly near the back, arms crossed, lips pressed together in silent frustration. Then at Harper, whose exhaustion ran deeper than just today, he turned back to Rick. Yes. A hush fell over the restaurant. Rick blinked as if he hadn't fully processed the word. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Isaiah's voice remained firm. I trusted you to manage this store with integrity. Instead, you've created a toxic environment that's driving good employees away. He motioned toward the staff. Look around, Rick. Do you see anyone stepping in to defend you? Rick's gaze flickered over the employees. No one spoke. No one even moved. Isaiah took a step closer. That tells me everything I need to know. Rick's jaw twitched. For a moment, Isaiah thought he might argue, but then Rick exhaled sharply and shook his head. Fine. His voice was clipped, his anger barely contained. You want me gone. I'm gone. He yanked off his store-issued name tag and tossed it onto the counter. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the exit. The door swung shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Isaiah turned to the employees. Some looked stunned, others relieved, but no one spoke right away. Harper was the first to break the silence. Her voice was quiet but steady. What happens now? Isaiah met her gaze. Now we fix what's broken. He turned to Lewis. I've seen the way you handle things. You step in when Rick wouldn't. You try to keep things running despite everything working against you. He paused. I want you to take over as manager. Lewis's eyes widened slightly. Me. You've already been doing the job, Isaiah said. But now you'll have the authority to actually make things better. Lewis hesitated. And what about corporate? What about the way this store is run? Isaiah nodded. We're making changes. Better staffing, fair scheduling, and actual support for employees. No more running this place into the ground for the sake of numbers. His gaze swept across the room. And that includes higher wages and benefits. The employees exchanged glances, murmurs of surprise and cautious hope passing between them. Isaiah turned back to Harper. You've kept this place running despite everything working against you. You shouldn't have to struggle just to survive. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded check. This is for you. Harper's brow furrowed. What? A bonus, Isaiah clarified, for everything you've put up with. For everything you've given to this job when you didn't have to. She hesitated, eyes flickering between the check and Isaiah's face. I know pride makes it hard to accept help, Isaiah said gently, but you deserve this. Harper swallowed. Then slowly she reached out and took the check. When she unfolded it, her breath caught. Her hands trembled as she looked back at Isaiah. This is too much. It's exactly what you deserve, Isaiah corrected. Her eyes shimmered, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Isaiah gave a single nod. Then he turned back to the rest of the employees. Things changed today, he said, his voice steady, and I promise I'll be here to make sure of it. Isaiah stood in the middle of the restaurant, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him. The employees were still processing everything, exchanging quiet glances, some whispering to one another. The tension that had dominated the store for so long had finally cracked, but what remained was uncertainty. Change had been promised, but promises alone weren't enough. Lewis exhaled, shifting his stance as if grounding himself. He had just been handed responsibility he hadn't expected, and Isaiah could see the gears turning in his head. Taking over as manager meant more than just stepping into a leadership role, it meant undoing years of damage. Harper still held the check, her fingers gripping the edges tightly. She hadn't said much after accepting it, but the emotion in her eyes lingered. Isaiah knew what it was like to carry burdens alone, to feel as though asking for help was a weakness. The fact that she had accepted it at all told him just how much she truly needed it. The other employees stood by, a mixture of cautious optimism and hesitation in their faces. They had seen people in power make promises before. They weren't celebrating yet. Isaiah turned to Lewis. His voice was steady, intentional. First thing we need to do is set up a meeting with the team. This isn't just about replacing Rick, it's about making real changes. Lewis nodded, straightening his posture. We'll need to go over scheduling. People have been pulling doubles just to keep this place running. Isaiah glanced at the workers, catching the exhaustion still present in their expressions. No more of that. We hire enough staff so no one is overworked. And we make sure everyone gets their breaks, no exceptions. A few heads lifted at that. A woman near the fry station, who had remained silent through the confrontation, finally spoke up. I haven't had a proper lunch break in months. Rick would always say we were too busy to stop. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. That changes now. One of the younger employees hesitated before speaking. Does that mean we're actually getting raises, or is that just talk? Isaiah met his gaze directly. It's real. Wages are increasing. I'll make sure payroll reflects that starting next cycle. A murmur of surprise passed through the group. Some of them still looked skeptical, but others exchanged nods, as if allowing themselves a small amount of hope. Lewis ran a hand over his face, exhaling. We're going to have to rebuild trust. People have been worn down for too long to believe anything right away. Isaiah nodded. That's exactly why I'll be here more often. No more relying on reports from middle management. I want to hear directly from the people working here. That got a reaction. Employees glanced at one another, as if trying to determine if he really meant it. Owners didn't usually show up unless something was wrong. The idea that he would be present regularly was almost unheard of. Harper finally spoke again. Her voice was quieter now, but her words carried weight. If you're serious about all of this, then we're going to need more than just new policies. We need to know that if something goes wrong, we won't be ignored like before. Isaiah met her eyes. You won't be. From now on, there will be a direct line to corporate that actually gets listened to. And any manager who tries to silence complaints the way Rick did won't last long. That statement seemed to land. A few employees exchanged glances, and for the first time, some of the tension in their shoulders eased. Lewis rubbed at his chin, thinking, we'll also need to change the way we handle promotions. Too many good people have been overlooked. Isaiah agreed immediately. We'll start identifying employees who want to move up and make sure they get the training they need. No more dead-end jobs. Harper tilted her head slightly, considering that. You really mean all of this, don't you? Isaiah didn't hesitate. Yes. Something in her expression shifted, not quite trust yet, but something close. The employees slowly began to break off, returning to their stations, but the energy in the room had changed. There was still exhaustion, still wariness, but now there was something else. A possibility. Isaiah watched as Lewis immediately got to work, speaking with employees, taking notes, and already beginning to adjust schedules. Harper lingered for a moment before finally tucking the check carefully into her pocket. As she turned to head back behind the counter, she paused. I guess we'll see if things really change. Isaiah gave a small nod. We will. She studied him for a moment longer before finally stepping away. Isaiah exhaled, running a hand through his hair. There was still so much to fix, so much to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And this time, he wouldn't let himself lose sight of the people who made his business possible. Isaiah remained in the restaurant long after the evening shift had ended. The crew had trickled out one by one, exhaustion still clinging to their expressions, but softened now by something else: relief. The shift had been smoother than usual. Without Rick's presence looming over them, there had been fewer tense exchanges, fewer moments of hesitation before asking for help. Lewis had stayed behind to help with close-out paperwork, his brow furrowed in concentration as he navigated the responsibilities that now rested on his shoulders. He didn't complain, but Isaiah could tell he was carrying the weight of the transition. The restaurant felt different in the quiet. Without the usual frantic energy of a packed dining room or the chaos of a dinner rush, it was easier to take in the details: the scuffed counters, the flickering menu board, the way the floor tiles near the fryer had worn down from years of hurried footsteps. Lewis finally exhaled and set his pen down. He stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the tension. This is going to take some time, he admitted, glancing up at Isaiah. Fixing everything, I mean. People are still waiting to see if this is real. Isaiah nodded, leaning against the counter. I know, change doesn't happen overnight. Lewis hesitated. Some of them still don't trust corporate. After what happened with Rick, they think anyone in charge is just going to end up the same way. Isaiah understood that skepticism. It wasn't just about one bad manager, it was about an entire culture that had allowed someone like Rick to thrive for so long. Undoing that wouldn't be as simple as firing one person or increasing wages. We have to earn their trust, Isaiah said. Not with words, with actions. Lewis considered that. He tapped his fingers against the counter before finally speaking again. Harper's still struggling. Even with the bonus, it's not enough to fix everything overnight. Isaiah had noticed the same thing. She had accepted the check, but there had been no celebration in her expression, just quiet acceptance, like someone who had learned not to get their hopes up. I want her on a path to something better, Isaiah said. She's been stuck treading water for too long. Lewis nodded. She's one of the hardest workers here, but she's never had a way out of this cycle. He hesitated before adding, if there's a way to get her into management training, she'd take it. She just doesn't believe it's possible. That was something Isaiah could change. The restaurant door swung open and Harper stepped inside. She looked surprised to see them both still there, her expression guarded. I left my phone in the back, she said, brushing a stray piece of hair behind her ear. Lewis motioned toward the office. Go ahead. Isaiah watched as she walked past, her posture stiff, as if bracing for something. It was clear she wasn't used to being in the same room as people in charge without expecting bad news. When she emerged a moment later, she hesitated near the counter, her grip tightening around the phone in her hand. Didn't expect you to still be here, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Isaiah met her gaze. There's a lot to fix. She gave a small nod, shifting her weight. Then, after a long pause, she spoke again. You really meant it, didn't you? All of it. Isaiah didn't hesitate. Yes. She studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she exhaled, her shoulders losing some of their tension. I'm not used to people actually following through, she admitted. Isaiah understood that all too well. I want you to do more than just survive here, Harper, he said. Lewis and I were talking. If you're interested, I want you in management training. Her eyes widened slightly, caught off guard. Me. You already know how to run this place, Lewis added. You've been doing it without the title or the pay. Harper looked between them, as if waiting for the catch. And this isn't some pity thing, Isaiah shook his head. It's recognizing potential. She was quiet for a long moment. Then finally she spoke. I don't know if I can do it. You can, Lewis said firmly. You've been doing it. Isaiah could see the conflict in her expression. The part of her that wanted to believe it was possible warring with the part that had been let down too many times. Think about it, Isaiah said gently. No pressure, but the opportunity is yours if you want it. Harper nodded slowly. I'll think about it. And for the first time all day, there was something in her voice that sounded like hope. Isaiah watched as she left, the door swinging shut behind her. Lewis let out a breath. That's the first time I've ever seen her consider something beyond just making it to the next paycheck. Isaiah nodded. It won't be the last. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There was still so much to fix, so much to rebuild. But as he stood in that quiet restaurant, Isaiah knew one thing for certain: change had begun. And this time, it wasn't just a promise. It was real.